Hello, church family. Pastor Jim Cohn here as we continue our study in the book of Psalms. We're going to look today at Psalm 50. Psalm 50 is a didactic psalm. It's not a messianic psalm. We've looked at some that have given a picture of Jesus. This is not a prophetic psalm that it looks ahead into the future, but it's a didactic psalm. It teaches a moral lesson. That's important because when we see the courtroom that unfolds before us, we might think this is a picture of the final judgment. But Asaph, the writer of this psalm, is teaching us a lesson from God's inspired words. So we want to learn that. Asaph was a Levite musician, and he wrote several psalms responsible for Psalms 73 through 83. And he writes this Psalm 50. I want you to look at the first few verses. In verses 1 through 6, we see a courtroom scene. The mighty one, God the Lord, speaks. He summons earth from the rising of his sun to its setting. From Zion, God appears in radiance. Our God is coming. He will not be silent. Devouring fire precedes him. We see God appear and gathers the nation before him, and he appears as a judge. The heavens proclaim his righteousness, for God is the judge. So he assembles the nations, the nation of Israel, to teach them a lesson. And he's going to teach two lessons. And the first lesson is in verses 7 through 15, and the second lesson is in verses 16 through 23. Let's look quickly at it. It says, "Listen, my people, and I will testify against you, Israel, for I do not rebuke you for your sacrifices or your burnt offerings, which are continually before me." God is not criticizing them for the lack of their worship or the lack of their offering or the lack of their sacrifice. And he says, though, "For every animal of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird of the mountains." God says, "I don't need your sacrifices." And he goes on to say, "If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and everything in it's mine." God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Everything in the world is his. Many of the pagan gods, the people that worship them, believed they needed to feed their gods in order for them to have enough to eat. But God doesn't need any of that. He says, "I don't need all of that." But he tells us in verse 13, "Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats?" No, of course he doesn't. "But sacrifice a thank offering to God and pay your vows to the Most High." God is saying, "I don't want you to do more worship, or I don't need you to worship more often. I'm pleased with that, but I need you to improve the quality of your offering." And he tells them in verse 14 to give a thank offering. A thank offering was a specific kind of offering in the Jewish faith that thanked God for something that he had done. If the nation had gone through a time of drought and they prayed about it and God delivered them with rain, they would give a thank offering because of what God was done. God is saying to the Israelites, "I don't want you to go through ritualistic worship just to keep going on in tradition, to do the same thing year after year after year, but I want you to recognize who I am and what I've done for you and give thanks for that." He wanted their worship to be genuine and based on what he had done for them. That's a great lesson for us. So as we begin to get ready as a church to come back to worship, we don't need to worship God because that's what we do, because we're comfortable with it, because we like it. But we worship God because of who he is and what he's done. In our own way, we want to give God a thank offering, to recognize God for the things that he's done for us. And then he turns to the second section, the second lesson here, and that's in verses 16 through 23. And here he addresses the hypocrisy of the nation of Israel. "But God says to the wicked, what right do you have to recite my statutes, to take my covenant on your lips? You hate instruction and fling my words behind you. When you see a thief, you make friends with him. When you associate with adulterers, when you unleash your mouth for evil." God says the nation of Israel would recite the statutes of God, yet they tolerate sin amongst them. They're tolerant of a thief, of an adulterer, of a slanderer. And so he says you've got to clean that up in your life and recognize that sin is offensive to a holy God. And he says, "But I will rebuke you," down in verse 21, "and I'll lay out the case before you." Understand this in verse 22, "You who forget God, understand this, you who forget God, or I will tear you apart." There's judgment to people that forget who God is. And so he warns them and cautions them as they get ready to go about their daily ritual of worship. So the first issue is don't worship out of ritual or rote or tradition or ceremony, but worship out of a sense of thanksgiving. And the second thing is don't worship out of hypocrisy, that we say one thing to God and then do another thing that we think God doesn't see. But he says, look at our heart. Don't tolerate the sin that's amongst us in our own life and the life around us. And so we want to be clean before God when we come to worship. I want you to pay special attention to verse 10. That's one of my favorite verses. That God recognizes that every animal of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird of the mountain. God is letting us know that he owns all of this, that he's the master of everything. Every animal of the forest is his, the cattle on 1,000 hills, and all of that possession is God. God doesn't need our money. He desires our sacrifice out of a sense of thanksgiving and worship for what he's done for us. What a great lesson for us modern Christians. God bless you. Have a good day.